a break.
What's happening?
The show ended without an ending. 64 million viewers had been watching it. And then, in 1985, it was quietly canceled. Mid-story, mid-season, mid-sentence. The final episode never aired. The kids never got home. That's the fact you need to hold on to. Not the nostalgia. Not the Saturday mornings. The fact that the people who made this show, who built something genuinely ambitious inside the rigid machinery of 1980s children's television, lost control of it before they could finish it. And here's what makes that harder to dismiss. The show worked. For a brief window, it worked in a way that almost nothing else on Saturday morning television was working. It was dark in places that children's animation wasn't supposed to be dark. It took its audience seriously in a way that made certain adults extremely uncomfortable. Not performatively uncomfortable, genuinely, specifically uncomfortable. The kind that generates phone calls to network standards departments and letters written in careful handwriting. That discomfort is where this story really lives. Because the same qualities that made the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon something worth remembering, the moral ambiguity, the unresolved tension, the fact that the heroes never fully won, are the exact qualities that made it impossible to sustain inside the system that was broadcasting it. Success, in this case, carried a cost that wasn't visible at first. By the time it became visible, the damage was already done. There is one detail buried inside this show that has never been fully resolved. One of the 6 weapons carried by the teenagers at the center of the story never worked reliably. Not because it was broken, because of something in the person carrying it. That detail is the whole story. We'll get there.
And soon it shall all be mine. All will kneel to Calic.
The Rise. Why it worked. In September of 1983, CBS aired the first episode of the Dungeons & Dragons animated series. It arrived at a specific cultural moment, one where the tabletop game itself was already infamous. Congressional hearings. Moral panic. A significant portion of the American public had been told that Dungeons & Dragons was a gateway to something dangerous. The game had been blamed for disappearances, for suicides, for a vague but potent category of moral corruption that nobody could define precisely, but everybody seemed to recognize. That context mattered, because the show didn't run from it. The premise was clean and brutal. 6 teenagers, Hank, Eric, Diana, Bobby, Sheila, and a young boy named Uni, are pulled through a roller coaster into a medieval fantasy world. They meet a small cryptic guide called Dungeon Master, who gives each of them a weapon. And then they spend the entire run of the series trying to get home. They never make it. That's not a spoiler. That's the engine. Each episode brought them close. Each episode pulled the exit away. And the show was honest about the cost of that. Characters failed, plans collapsed, the team fractured under pressure. The villain, Venger, was not a cartoon menace. He was patient and systematic, and he kept winning. He didn't monologue. He didn't grant the heroes a graceful exit. He pursued them with the quiet efficiency of something that had already decided how the story ended. This wasn't what Saturday morning television was supposed to deliver. Now look at the weapons themselves, because they tell you something about the show's architecture that the episodes never said directly. Each teenager received a single item, and that item was not a utility device. It was a precision instrument, calibrated to the personality of the person carrying it. The weapons were portraits. And if you read them carefully, they tell you exactly how the show understood each of the people it was built around. Hank, the ranger, carried a bow. When he drew the string, it didn't release an arrow. It released a coherent plasma bolt, a directed energy weapon, variable yield, long range. His leadership encoded in the act of aiming before firing. You don't fire that bow in panic. You fire it after you've already decided. Eric, the cavalier, the one the show positioned as the coward, was given a shield, not a weapon. A defensive field generator, capable of producing an energy barrier that nothing penetrated. The show understood the irony, and it didn't soften it. The least courageous member of the group carried the only purely protective technology. His weapon was the one that kept the others alive. Diana, the acrobat, carried a javelin that extended and retracted on command, and when braced against the ground, produced enough vertical thrust to launch her beyond any wall, any barrier, any ceiling the world put in front of her. Her weapon was freedom of movement, the refusal to be contained. Bobby, the youngest, carried a club. dense, heavy, with a kinetic amplification system at its core that multiplied the force of impact far beyond what any child his size should have been able to generate. The smallest member of the group, carrying disproportionate destructive power. The show didn't comment on that. It just showed it, episode after episode. Sheila, the thief, wore a cloak that rendered her invisible, a light-absorbing material that continuously drew power to maintain its field. Her weapon was disappearance, the ability to move through a world that couldn't see her coming. And then there was Presto. Presto, the magician, carried a hat, not a precision instrument, not a calibrated tool. A hat that reached into somewhere unspecified and produced, sometimes, what was needed. And sometimes, something else entirely. Something useless or dangerous or simply wrong. Of the 6 weapons, Presto's was the only one that could not be reliably controlled. The bow fired when Hank drew it. The shield held when Eric raised it. But the hat responded to intention filtered through confidence. And Presto had no confidence. Every episode, he reached in expecting one thing and received another. The engineering term for this is operator dependence, a system whose output is determined not by its own design, but by the psychological state of the person running it. Stable operators produce stable outputs. An operator who believes the system will fail tends to be right. The system doesn't malfunction. It simply reflects back what the operator brought to it. The show knew what it was doing with Presto. It was building toward something. By the second season, the writers were pushing hard at the edges of what the format allowed, exploring sacrifice, consequence, and moral weight that the network had not originally anticipated. The momentum was real. The ambition was accelerating. And underneath it, quietly, so was the pressure.
Is that good news? Don't you see? It was Varla's illusion. The illusion's still here.
When it almost broke. Here is the specific moment where the show's architecture began to exceed what the system around it could support. The writers wanted to kill Dungeon Master, not permanently, but meaningfully. They wanted an episode where the cryptic, manipulative guide, the figure who had been sending 6 children into danger for 3 seasons without ever fully explaining why, faced genuine consequence. They wanted the audience to feel the weight of what Dungeon Master had been doing. The cost of following someone whose motives you could never fully read. The network said no. Sit with that for a moment. Because that decision, seemingly small, a single rejected storyline, was the load-bearing crack. The show's entire emotional architecture depended on one thing: that nothing was protected from consequence. That the rules were real and applied to everyone, including the characters the audience had been taught to trust. Once the network reasserted that certain figures were untouchable, that protection wasn't just a creative constraint. It was a signal. And audiences, even young audiences, perhaps especially young audiences, are exquisitely sensitive to signals that the rules have exceptions. Children, in particular, are practiced at detecting when the stakes have been quietly lowered. They may not name it, but they feel it. The writers continued working. They were professionals, and they found ways to push within the new constraints. But something had shifted in the structure. There is a question that the show had been building toward since the first episode, and it concerns the weapons. Specifically, it concerns what happens when all 6 are in the field simultaneously, under real pressure, with no margin for error. The 6 weapons, taken together, comprised something that functioned like a complete system, each instrument optimized for its operator, each reflecting a single personality with remarkable precision. But the system had a flaw that no amount of individual excellence could compensate for. There was no redundancy. If Hank went down, long-range energy projection was gone. If Eric was incapacitated, the defensive barrier vanished. If Sheila was compromised, infiltration capabilities ceased to exist. No teenager could operate another's equipment. There was no backup. The loss of any one component removed that capability from the group entirely. That's not a coincidence of design. That's a philosophy. And the show was about to discover what happens when a philosophy meets a system that has decided it wants something different.
Get Dungeon Master out of here! I can take care of these, Bob!
The fall. Structural, not personal. The cancellation came in 1985 after 3 seasons and 27 episodes. Here is the verdict. The show was canceled by the same instinct that had made it necessary to create it carefully in the first place. The official reasoning involved ratings pressure and the shifting economics of Saturday morning programming. That's accurate as far as it goes, but the structural collapse had been happening longer than the ratings reflected. The show had been built on a specific promise that consequences were real, that the children were genuinely lost, that the darkness of the world they'd been dropped into was not decorative. That promise was what separated it from everything else on the schedule. It was what the audience of 64 million had come for, even if they couldn't have named it. And it was a promise the network was never fully comfortable keeping. Each time the writers pushed toward consequence, toward the natural endpoint of a show about children who couldn't get home, the broadcast constraints pushed back. The same moral panic that had made the Dungeons & Dragons name infamous was now operating from inside the production. The network needed the show to be safe. The show had been built on being unsafe. The same instinct that made the show necessary, the audience's hunger for animation that didn't treat them as fragile, was the instinct the network was trying to manage. When those two forces met directly, only one of them controlled the broadcast schedule. Look again at the weapons system. The flaw the ensemble shared was not technical, it was architectural. 6 precision instruments, each dependent on a single operator, with no cross-functionality and no collective backup. The system had been designed for maximum individual expression and minimum collective resilience. That structure mirrored the production exactly. The creative ambition was centralized in the writers. The constraints were rigid in the network. The relationship between those two forces had no flexibility engineered into it. When pressure arrived, from regulators, from advertisers, from the broader cultural anxiety of the 1980s surrounding the Dungeons & Dragons brand, there was no give in the system. No alternative pathway. No redundancy. No way for one part of the structure to absorb what another part couldn't carry. The whole thing moved together and fell together. Presto's hat was always the indicator. A system whose output depended entirely on the confidence of its operator. By 1985, the confidence was gone. Not because the writers had failed, because the system around them had made failure feel inevitable. And once that feeling takes hold, the hat stops working.
Can you dig any faster?
Ease off, loud.
There is a completed script for the final episode of Dungeons & Dragons. It was written. It exists. In it, the children get home. The writer was Michael Reeves. The episode was titled Requiem. The script was completed, registered, and set aside when the cancellation came through. The voice cast never recorded it. The animators never touched it. For years, it circulated among fans as a photocopy, proof that the resolution was real and specific and achievable, that it had been thought through carefully by someone who understood what the show had been trying to do. The ending existed. The machinery ran out of time before the story ran out of things to say. That gap between a finished script sitting in a drawer and a story that never reached its final frame is the specific shape of what was lost here. Not an abandoned idea, a completed one that simply never got through. What that means in concrete terms. Hank's bow was never fired for the last time. Eric's shield was never raised at the moment it would have mattered most. The cloak was never removed in a world that was finally safe. Bobby never put the club down. Those moments were written. They just never happened. There's a detail about how the 6 weapons were powered that the show never explained on screen, and that matters here. The instruments didn't draw from individual sources, each one isolated, self-contained. They drew from a shared field. The same underlying energy that made Hank's bow fire made Presto's hat reach. The same source that kept Eric's shield up kept Sheila's cloak invisible. Which means this: when one instrument was under pressure, all of them were. When confidence drained from one part of the system, it drained from the whole. The weapons weren't 6 separate problems. They were one problem wearing 6 different faces. The missing data was never the dimensions of Hank's bow. It was never the weight of Bobby's club. It was never the radius of Eric's shield or the reach of Diana's javelin at full extension. The missing data was always the same question: how long could this run before it stopped? The answer, it turned out, was 3 seasons. Not because the energy ran out, because the system around it decided to stop drawing from the source.
What is it?
Dungeon Master's young pupils. They seek the golden grimoire.
The lasting question. Presto's hat never worked reliably because Presto never believed it would. That is the thing the show understood about itself that it could never say out loud. Belief was the power source, not ambient energy, not the psionic interface between operator and instrument. The whole system ran on the audience's willingness to stay inside the story, to accept that the rules were real, that the stakes were real, that the darkness was real and applied to everyone. When the network began protecting certain elements from consequence, the belief started to thin. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way confidence erodes rather than breaks, quietly, across many small moments, compounding in ways that don't register until the system is already past the point where the damage can be reversed. Until one day, the hat reaches in and comes up empty. The children never got home, not because the writers couldn't finish the story, because the system around the story couldn't afford to let them try. That question, whether a story can survive long enough to reach its own ending when the machinery around it is working against it, doesn't resolve cleanly. It just sits there, attached to the thing you loved, outlasting the thing itself. It never does. If that kind of question, what was actually built inside the things we watched when we were young, and why it ended the way it did, is the kind of thing you think about, subscribing means you won't miss what's next.